Master of the Queen's Music is a post in the royal household of the Sovereign of the United Kingdom. The holder of the post originally served the monarch of England, directing the court orchestra and composing or commissioning music as required. The post is broadly comparable to that of Poet Laureate. It is given to people eminent in the field of classical music. They have almost always been composers. Duties are not clearly stated, though it is generally expected the holder of the post will write music to commemorate important royal events, such as coronations, birthdays, anniversaries, marriages and deaths, and to accompany other ceremonial occasions. The individual may also act as the sovereign's advisor in musical matters. Since 2004, the appointment has been for a fixed term of 10 years rather than for life, as previously. The King's Music. In the 14th century, professional music making in England was theoretically regulated by the Crown. Musicians known as the King's Minstrels, or the King's Music, wore the royal livery and exercised some control of other musicians, although the musicologist Leonard Dyck describes that control as nominal. Henry VI appointed a royal commission to regulate unlicensed minstrelsy, and in 1469 Edward IV granted the royal minstrels a guild charter. According to the charter, no minstrel of our kingdom shall henceforth in any way practice or publicly exercise the art or occupation within our kingdom aforesaid, unless he belong to the said brotherhood or guild. This led to legal difficulties between the royal minstrels and the city company under the patronage of the City of London, chartered by James I in 1604 to perform in the city and 3 miles outside it. The King's Minstrels requested and received a charter from Charles I in 1635 to have the survey, scrutiny, correction and government of all and singular the musicians within the Kingdom of England. First Masters of the King's Music. The first appointed Master of the King's Music was the only one seriously to attempt to rule all the musicians in the kingdom as a guild. This was Nicholas Lanier, appointed by Charles I in 1626 as Master of the King's Music. At the time the holder of the post took charge of the monarch's private band, a responsibility which continued until the band was dissolved in 1901 by Edward VII. The position lapsed during the period of military rule following the Civil War, but on the restoration of the monarchy in 1660 Lanier returned from exile to resume the revived post. After Lanier's death in 1666, Charles II appointed a French violinist, Louis Grabu, to the post. Grabu was primarily concerned with organizing the music for the court, and the Westminster Musicians Guild fell into decline, coming to an end after 1697. Neither Grabu nor his successor Nicholas Staggins, who served from 1674 to 1700, was a talented composer. They turned to established composers such as Henry Purcell to supply music for important occasions. 18th century. Staggins was succeeded by John Eccles, who was appointed by William III in June 1700. Eccles was the longest-serving master, holding the post for 35 years. He is also the only one to have served 4 monarchs. He was already a well-known composer before his appointment, described by Grove's Dictionary of Music and Musicians as undoubtedly the greatest of the Restoration theatre composers after Purcell. He nevertheless continued his predecessor's practice of commissioning works from other composers, including Handel, who supplied the ode for the birthday of Queen Anne. Dyck comments that Handel's eminence as a composer evidently did not qualify him as a suitable candidate for the honor of Master of the King's Music. The Hanoverian kings clearly played safe by choosing musicians of unimpeachable native breeding. After Eccles's death in 1735, his post was filled by Maurice Green, who already held the posts of organist of St. Paul's Cathedral and organist and composer of the Chapel Royal. He held the post for 20 years, but his health was never robust, and he frequently called on his former pupil William Boyce to compose the birthday and New Year odes written by the Poet Laureate in honor of the king. After Green died in December 1755, Boyce succeeded him as Master of the King's Music, and later in the Chapel Royal appointment. It was probably in the latter capacity rather than the former that Boyce provided what Grove calls an imposing and deeply felt orchestral anthem for the funeral of George II on the 11th of November 1760. A splendid setting of "The King Shall Rejoice" for the wedding of George III and Princess Charlotte on the 8th of September 1761, and 8 anthems for the coronation of the king later in the same month. Boyce died in 1779, and was succeeded as master by another former pupil of Green, John Stanley, who held the post until he died in 1786. He composed 15 birthday and New Year odes, but none of them have survived. The last master appointed in the 18th century was Sir William Parsons. He was viewed by his contemporaries as an affable man but a musician of limited ability, although his court music cannot be assessed, having mostly been lost. He is believed to be the first professional musician to have been knighted in Britain, although it was said that the honor was more for the score of his merits than because of the merits of his scores. 19th century. Parsons held the post of master until 1817, when he was succeeded by William Shield, best known as a theatre composer. He composed or arranged music for at least 36 operas and 7 pantomimes and ballets. Shield's tenure is most notable for the abandonment of the traditional provision of court odes. By custom, the Poet Laureate of the day read the words for the odes, a task that the then-holder, Robert Southey, found uncongenial. After the death of George III in 1820, the odes were discontinued. The post of Master of the King's Music continued because George IV maintained the traditional small orchestra, which Shield's successor, Christian Kramer, directed. That remained the chief function of the master through the tenures of Franz Kramer, George Frederick Anderson, and Sir William Cousins. The last of these produced a few works for royal occasions, including a Jubilee cantata, Grant the Queen a Long Life. The last master appointed in the 19th century was Sir Walter Parrot, organist of St. George's Chapel, Windsor. His tenure lasted 31 years from 1893, under the reigns of 3 monarchs, Queen Victoria, Edward VII and George V. In Dyck's view, Parrot's role was chiefly that of musical advisor to the Crown. Among his actions in that capacity were inviting Elgar to set A.C. Benson's verses as a coronation ode for Edward VII in 1901 and to write an anthem for the anniversary of Queen Victoria's death in 1909. Parrot's own official compositions included a contribution to a collection of choral songs by various composers in honor of Queen Victoria and a confortaire for the coronation service of Edward VII. 20th century. After Parrot's death in 1924, there was a body of opinion that the position of master was an anachronism, with neither a royal band to direct nor regular royal odes to compose. Elgar, who was well regarded by the royal family, pressed the case for retaining the post. According to the music writer Nicholas Kenyon, he also lobbied shamelessly for his own candidacy for it. Other names, including that of Ralph Vaughan Williams, had been suggested, but George V and his advisers took the view that, if the post is to go to the most eminent musician, it would hardly be possible to go beyond Elgar. Elgar's appointment was announced in May 1924. The Times commented, It is entirely fitting that in the changed condition of the office he should be made Master of the King's Music and the Musician Laureate of the British people. Elgar was not required to write any official music in his new capacity, but in 1931 he dedicated his nursery suite to the Duchess of York and her two daughters. He used his influence as master to track down the original instruments of Edward VII's band, to ensure the Royal Music Library was well ordered, and to secure recognition for other musicians, including a knighthood for Granville Bantock and the Companion of Honor for Delius. As musical aid to the king, he gave advice about such topics as the foundation of a national opera company, the correct version of the national anthem to be broadcast by the BBC, and the musical events at which members of the royal family should be present. Elgar died in 1934. He was succeeded by Sir Walford Davies, organist of St George's Chapel, Windsor, who had been rumoured to be in the running for the post in 1924. In a 1966 retrospective of the various masters, Charles Cudworth wrote that Davies was a fine musician, a good composer, and was even better known as one of the world's first great broadcasters, so the appointment was popular. Quote, when Davies died in 1941, Sir Arnold Bax replaced him, to the surprise of many in the musical world. With his strong affinities with Republican Ireland, and no record of writing occasional music, he seemed an unlikely choice. Bax died in 1953. Many expected his successor to be Sir William Walton, but to the latter's relief the post went to Sir Arthur Bliss. In the Times, the critic Frank House commented, the duties of a master of the Queen's music are what he chooses to make of them, but they include the composition of ceremonial and occasional music. Bliss, who composed quickly and with facility, was able to discharge the calls on him as master, providing music as required for state occasions, for the birth of a child to the Queen, to the funeral of Winston Churchill, to the investiture of the Prince of Wales. When Bliss died in 1975, Walton and others lobbied for the appointment of Malcolm Arnold. There was some surprise that Bliss's successor was the Australian composer Malcolm Williamson. Walton attributed the appointment to the need for cementing the cracks in the Commonwealth. Williamson held the post from 1975 until his death in 2003, composing works including Lament in Memory of Lord Mountbatten of Burma, Ode for Queen Elizabeth, 21st Century. Sir Peter Maxwell Davies was appointed to the mastership in 2004 in succession to Williamson. For the first time the appointment was for a fixed 10-year term rather than for life, with the aim of making the post more attractive to composers. Maxwell Davies' work as master included A Christmas Carol for the Queen, which was recorded by the Chapels Royal, and a work to accompany a poem by the Poet Laureate, Andrew Motion, to mark the Queen's 80th birthday in 2006. He played a key role in the creation of the Queen's Medal for Music. After the end of Maxwell Davies' term, Judith Weir was appointed in 2014 for a 10-year term. Reporting the appointment, The Guardian said that rather than writing pieces for royal occasions, Weir would concentrate on supporting and speaking up for her composer colleagues, challenging the function that contemporary music fulfills in society, and embarking on a nationwide exploration of the state of music education in order to create pieces that will be useful for schoolchildren and amateur musicians. Holders of the post